So this is going to be a fairly informal session. My name is Pierre. I'm the founder of NetGovern. We specialize in information governance, which is helping organizations to address the fundamental questions of what data do you have, where do you keep it, how long do you keep it for, who gets to look at it, and how do you audit all of that. And so seems pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But it has a lot of technology challenges underneath. And what I want to do is I want to share a little bit of our experience in terms of the regulatory frameworks, the evolution, the habits, the workplace, and how organizations are trying to tackle this with disparate data sources. And so we paint a fairly clear sandbox around what we do, right? We think that people come into organizations every day, and they sort of tend to spend their time in one or two areas. Either they're working in structured data, so they're working in applications. And on the structured data side of things, it's pretty clear, right? We have data accuracy in databases that make sure that we can't put anything into any fields. We have security that's built into the application in terms of making sure that we can't just copy things over. Generally, data access rights are covered in the structured side. It gets a little bit different in the unstructured side, which is where the other group of people that come into organizations every day, and they live in the world of PowerPoint, in the world of email, in the world of Word docs, in the words of Excel spreadsheets, who just create content, right? And we want to create this content because eventually we're going to share it. We're going to share it with our employees. We're going to share it with our partners. We're going to share it across our customer base. This is the unstructured data that every day when you hear the stats, right, that this year we will have created more information than was created in the 2,000 years of humanity. These are the stats that you hear when we talk about data breaches, right, and the famous law that says two things happen to data. It either gets lost or it becomes public. And so you need to figure out how you're going to reduce your attack surface, the footprint of available documents inside the organization, because there's no point in preserving all of the information if it doesn't have any business value, right? And so shoveling data forward or moving data from one silo into a data lake and then applying capabilities on that doesn't really make, doesn't provide any value to the business if the content there doesn't matter anymore. And so that's the sandbox that we live in, right? So unstructured, human-generated unstructured data is what we like to focus on, and helping organizations with this arc from the level of maturity 0, which is I don't really know what I have, to eventually information governance, where I know what I have, I know how long I'm going to keep it, what tools I'm going to use in terms of e-discovery, and how I'm going to provide the reporting back if I have a regulatory constraint, or if my board just wants me to say that, yeah, you're managing the informational assets of the organization in a way that makes sense. And so what we've found is that most of our clients don't want to be A+ students. They find that being an A+ student is too expensive, too complicated, too difficult. They're very happy to be a B+ student, right? They want to get to a level of maturity that lets them have the right controls in place, lets them manage their information, but without spending millions of dollars on an information governance program. And so a lot of this, in terms of the thinking through it, the kind of two vectors. One is this concept that information wants to be free. And you've certainly heard of that before, because the right information in the right hands of the right people at the right point in time creates value. The issue that we have is that people do dumb things often, and information needs to be controlled. And so what we need is the capability to balance both of those off. And as we live more and more in a mobile-first, cloud-first world where the information is automatically created in a way that it can be shared with very little friction, we have this contention, right, between those both tendencies. Information wants to be free, but information needs to be controlled, right? That's on one side. And the other hand is this concept that storage is cheap, storage is free, or near free, and therefore we can just kind of create at will. And there's a problem with that perspective, right? The problem with that perspective is if we applied it to physical objects, right, it doesn't work. And so, does anybody here work in a company where you have to manage inventory, like spare parts? Yeah. Okay. If I'll build a story out. Today it's pretty warm outside, and in the office of the CEO, the air conditioning unit, blows up, and so it becomes pretty uncomfortable. And the repair guy comes into the office and needs to change a belt on the air conditioning unit, and we find out that we don't have the belt, and so goes out to the storeroom and say, got to find one, and we find that the only supplier of these belts, because it's a fairly old unit, is a place halfway across town. So we send a driver halfway across town. And we get halfway across town, and he says, I've just been told that they only have 3 of these belts left in inventory for this model that's not manufactured. Do you want me to buy all 3? And the manager says, absolutely, get them just in case. And so we buy all 3, we come back and we fix the unit, and we put 2 units on the shelf. And those 2 units on the shelf, we've now created a problem for ourselves, because we need to count them, we need to manage them, right? They're part of the physical assets of the company. And within 5 years, we've moved the headquarters from that office. We're now in a new building. That air conditioning unit doesn't exist anymore. We still have the 2 belts on the shelf. For the next 10 years, we're still counting those 2 belts, and they're moved from one system to the next. And there's an ongoing cost of that. And so by the time that we're done, 10 years later, those 2 belts have probably cost us something like $400 in terms of management fee for a belt that original purchase price was maybe like $3. And we do this, I use this story because we do this across our digital assets on a regular basis, right? We don't pay attention to what we create, and we don't pay attention. We lose stuff because we can't find it, so then we end up recreating it, right? That's a big problem. And then we move things around because the decision to delete, we have our platform, there's over 1,500 different controls that you can apply to data. In terms of retention schedules, it's got a pretty crazy sophistication. Does anybody here want to guess what our customers do in terms of settings for file retention? Everybody sets it at a 7-year deletion schedule. That's what 95% of our customers across financial services, across pharma, across government, 95%. 7 years and we delete. You know what happens at 7 years? We don't delete it. Because nobody wants to pull the trigger, right? Nobody wants to stand up and say, I'm the one that's going to do that. So we move forward. And so what we have now is we have customers that have hundreds of terabytes of data. Their indexes are tens of terabytes in size. Some of the things during the keynote that we spoke about, or that Will spoke about, in terms of being able to layer and scale out solar in the way that needs to be done so that customers can manage that volume of data, simply become very difficult to achieve or very expensive, because those decisions, nobody wants to take those decisions, right? Because there's not that clarity that exists. And so what we've come to the conclusion is you need to start with a process that enables your organization, and this is probably one of the key things that I'll say today, enables your organization to stop having conversations of opinion and move to discussions of evidence. And that's what search enables you to do. Because in our organizations, most of the time what happens is you go into a meeting and you need to make a decision about what we're going to do regarding X, right? And there's 7 people around the table, and the 7 people are going to have 7 very clear and often conflicting opinions about what's there. I think that, well, no, and then if you ask for the clarity, if you say, so what do we really have? Are you able to tell me what data, what files that we have at that location were created by individuals who may no longer be in our Active Directory, possibly for the past X years, where the file hasn't been opened in 6 years or more, right? File audit. And if you're able to get to that, then all of a sudden you have evidence. And that's a very different conversation inside your organization, because you're able to say, no, these are the duplicates, these are the files that, without even touching the actual content of the files, right? All we're doing is we're working at the metadata level. And now we're able to have a conversation of evidence and make decisions that enable us to say, well, we can get rid of all of that. We don't need to move that into Azure or into Office 365 or anywhere else, because there's no value to the organization. These are files that are over 10 years old, that haven't been accessed, the users, and do we have a business purpose? And if you do, well then perfect, then we can index them, and then we can run a lexicon or taxonomy. We can look at what we're gonna do for that. And so what I encourage you guys to do is as users either of Solar or LucidWorks, feel free to come and talk to us about how it is that your organization can embark on this journey from these smart stepping points, right? So start with the perspective of, okay, I need to get evidence so that I can analyze and I can eliminate what we call rot, right? Redundant, outdated, and trivial information. Once I have that and I've figured it out, then I'm able to put policy controls, on top of what's left and decide, okay, here's how we're going to manage. These assets are worth something to my organization. And if you want to do, simple buckets, again, 3 buckets. One bucket that you say, if this information got out into the open, what would happen? And if the answer is, well, nothing, well, then treat it that way, right? So Google famously has started to look at their own network and their own storage internally as being hostile, right? And they said, well, there's always the possibility that somebody inside or somebody will have access. And so we need to look at what information needs to be encrypted at rest all the time, because it's got too much value for the organization. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's things that, yes, we own, but we can share and it doesn't make a difference. And so first bucket. Second bucket, things that you would be willing to share, but in a controlled way. So you have to say, well, for these, we need to manage access rights. We need to have the capability of auditing the access rights inside of our organizations as they evolve. Too often what we're finding out is that access rights that were temporarily granted stay for very long periods of time. And we uncover the fact that 5 years after, a user still has access to a storage location because they were granted a temporary project, the ability to get that, right? So you want to monitor that. You want to make sure that in this center bucket that you're actively engaged. And then their third bucket, which is your critical, right? Confidentiality, integrity, accessibility are critical. Your organization cannot live without access to these files or to this content for more than a week, right? And you asked the question, you from a functional perspective, it's fairly simple. You have the conversations across legal, across human resources, across finance, and they never manage more in the aggregate than perhaps a dozen data types, right? And so let's use HR as an example. So with human resources, they're managing employment agreements, right? They're managing benefits, they're managing contracts. If you said, well, what would happen if you can't get access to that? If you lost that for a day, would the organization crumble? And their answer is going to be no. But if I couldn't get to it for a week, it might be a little bit problematic. And for a month, well then, yeah, we'd start recreating data. So there's a cost to that. And then you're managing this continuum of risk, right? That's what you're doing, is you're making sure that the amount of money that you're spending fits with the business objectives of the organization. And you'll discover that this matrix is actually quite quick to establish inside your organizations as you go through the functional groups, right? And you see what kind of information types they're managing, and you can categorize them, and then you can decide to apply the right types of technology on top of that, right? And not try and treat all of your data as equal citizens, because the reality is it's not. There's some data in organizations that is very valuable, and there's some data that is not that important to us overall. And unfortunately, most organizations don't equip themselves from a technology perspective to make those distinctions. They don't use the tools. And that's where information governance comes into play, right? It's a fairly new field. It used to be called records management. And we really spent a lot of time in the paper world and thinking of how we would move paper records. Now that we're creating digital first, it's moving into information governance. And so there's a whole set of practices. The practices if you attend an ARMA conference or if you go online to ARMA, you'll see that they've created a very complicated way of dealing with this. And we don't think that it's good to know about it, but the reality is in terms of implementing it, it's a lot more difficult. I've just been given a time's up. And so that's my message to you guys. If you have any questions, pc@netgovern.com is my email address. Feel free to drop me a line.